Now that we've discussed how to create a speech and how to find the information for a speech, we can move on to actually talking about how a speech can be used to persuade an audience. And the two key issues to understand first are the rhetorical situation, that is the circumstance in which the speech happens, and the range of acceptance, which is going to have to do with how far you can actually move an audience in a given speech. Now, the rhetorical situation is a concept that comes from ancient rhetoric, but actually applies to any communication situation, whether it's a public speech, one-on-one conversations, meetings, whatever. There's going to be four key elements, and they all apply. They just apply a little differently in each case. And for our purposes in this particular online class, you're going to notice how a couple of them are still there. They just interact differently with each other. Now, the first key element of the rhetorical situation is the speaker. Now, classically, we say the speaker because that's all they really cared about, the person who actually gets up and gives the talk. But that could be extended to include anybody who produces a message. So a writer, an artist, a sculptor, a musician, a director of a movie, anybody who's trying to send a message is a key element in the presentation, because we've recognized a long, long time ago that each speaker or sender, however you want to say that, has different qualities that affect the way we interpret the message. For example, my name is Shannon Scott, and every now and then if people read only an email from me, they'll assume that I'm a woman. And when they assume I'm a woman, they tend to interpret parts of the message as if I were a female, and that could lead to some, unusual situations. That's because every person brings their own qualities to the speech. The two key categories we would look back to are ethos and pathos. Ethos meaning the person's credibility, character, and competence. So if you already know, for example, that a person's a really good speaker and then they get up and give a good speech, you're not that surprised. But if somebody's not terribly good in front of an audience and they manage to really crush one, or even just do a decent job, that affects the way you interpret the message. Pathos is also important because each speaker tends to have their own set of skills that they can access. For example, if you look at a bunch of different people who are known for being funny, you'll often find that each of them is funny in a different way. So for example, Jim Carrey pulling all kinds of crazy faces and doing imitations is very different than somebody like Steve Martin, who's more interested in language and timing and using absurd situations. So pathos is accessed differently by those two different people, and not everybody's going to be able to do every kind of message. Here's an example. Think of this sentence just in a void. Assume nobody's saying it. You simply found it written like on a fortune cookie. Even that would be unusual. The U.S. government is not responding well to ISIS. This isn't my argument. I'm simply saying, think about how you would feel reading this sentence. Now think about how you'd feel reading the sentence if you knew it was stated by former President Obama. In this case, you would say, if you're somebody who's not a fan of Obama, you might say, it's weird that he's attacking the current president for how ISIS is being handled. Or, if you're a fan of the president, notice how you would interpret the message differently. Similarly, look at Trump. If he were to say the same thing, now that he's actually the person in the Oval Office, that message is very different than if it were coming from a former president. So the two messages are exactly the same in terms of their text, but very different in terms of their meaning because of the person who says it. Let's look at another example. What if somebody like a Miley Cyrus decided to weigh in on the issue? Now, she would probably get a lot of attention, going back to the idea of character from the ethos lecture, but that doesn't necessarily mean people would pay a lot of attention to what she actually says or means. Just because people listen to you doesn't mean they necessarily agree with you or trust you. Now let's look at another celebrity, someone like Angelina Jolie, who, although she is just a celebrity in terms of that classic just a celebrity mindset, notice that she's actually somebody who has visited these war-torn areas of the world and in fact is on the UN Council that deals with refugees and human rights violations. So she's got more information in her head, which means her ethos is probably a little higher, a lot higher actually, than Miley Cyrus's. But at the same time, she might not have the responsibility that somebody who's a president would have. So the speaker brings a lot to a message. All four of these people could say that same line and it would be interpreted differently. The next element of the rhetorical situation is occasion, and that means when and where the speech is made. Now this has two characteristics of its own, both physical and psychological. Now, for a classic speech, one that's given in front of a real audience, the physical characteristics would include things like the size and shape of the room, any kind of visual aids that you would present, how warm it is, are people comfortable, is it noisy outside, all kinds of stuff like that. So you have to control your environment. Here in our online class, the physical occasion still matters. Think about that video some of you might have seen where a guy was being interviewed on the BBC about a very serious international issue, and all of a sudden two of his kids came running into the room being goofy, and the mom had to come in and snag him out of the place. Notice the physical occasion includes controlling your environment. Most of you did a pretty good job with this. We had a couple of random dogs running around, some people's phones went off, these things happen. But that's one of the things you need to control as a speaker. That's the physical occasion. Now, the psychological occasion has more to do with the mood. Like, let's say, for example, you know that you've got a big test in your next class. It might be harder for you to pay attention during the previous class. Or go back to the example I gave you of whether Obama or Trump said the line about ISIS. If we went back 7 months ago, the message would be interpreted very differently because at that time Obama was in office and Trump was running for office. So the exact same line from the same two people would be interpreted differently because of the timing of the occasion. So remember to pay attention to those issues as you look at not only how to make your own speeches, but how you're interpreting the speeches of others. Now, of course, we also need to have the message. And this is the issue we've already covered in terms of the speech purpose. What is it you're trying to accomplish in a speech? This is really important to think about, even though it seems obvious. In many cases, people tend to put the wrong standards onto a speech. A great example of this would be when you go to the movies. If you're a person who wants to see a really intellectual, deep, emotional, symbolic movie, and then you walk into a new Transformers or Fast and the Furious movie, you might be really upset. Well, that's your own fault. You walked into a movie that was never probably going to have the message you were looking for. So you need to ask yourself, does the message really fit the purpose of the occasion? So when Michael Bay sits down to make a movie, he doesn't say, what can I do to make these cars that transform into robots that have a war with each other, what can I do to make them really touch people? That's not what he's going for. That's never what he's going for. So make sure you're grading the speech based on what it's supposed to do. Now, looking at your two upcoming speeches, the informative speech and the persuasive speech, this is really important. Some of you have sent me some rough drafts of informative speeches that tend to cross the line into persuasion. Think of an example like, say, sugary drinks. An informative speech would simply report to you the amount of sugar that's in the average soda or frappuccino or whatever, and leave the audience to make up their own minds about what to do about it and how to feel about it. That's informative. So if I grab my Mountain Dew bottle and tell you that it says that it has 240 calories per serving, that's purely informative. Now if I give a persuasive speech, my goal is going to be different, and I'm going to be telling you how to feel about it. I'm going to be telling you what to do about it. So make sure you think about the purpose of the speech. And this leads us to a term called exigence. And that basically answers the question, what called forth the speech? Why are you giving the speech in the first place? If you've ever been in a really bad team meeting at any job you've ever been at, or even in, say, like a student group, if you've been annoyed by the speaking situation, I can almost guarantee you that what happened is the person had one good reason to give a speech, but ended up giving more than just that one. Say, for example, a group of employees get together because there's a new policy about time cards. Cool, that has to happen. So the boss comes in, explains the new time card situation, everybody's good. They're not thrilled, but at least they all understand the message. But because they've got you all in a room, bosses will sometimes say, hey, I will now also tell them 4 other things that I probably should have done in other ways. And now the entire speech gets all muddled together. So make sure you ask yourself, why is this speech happening? When you look at your upcoming informative speech, another problem I've seen on a couple of the outlines is that people have chosen topics that don't require any research, either because the person is already fairly an expert or because the topic is too light to require research. Remember, the assignment you're going for here requires that you have 3 sources used in the speech. Even if you're an expert on the topic, you still need to have those sources. The reason why? The exigence that I've put on you is I want to see how you do research, and I want to see how you add the research into your speech. Because even if you're an expert, many audiences might not know about that expertise until you prove it to them. And also, if you speak to a hostile audience, you might have to use research even when you are an expert. And finally, there's a lot of situations in which you won't be an expert, so I want you to learn how to do research. So the exigence for the next speech is structure and research. Now, the final concept is audience. You have to think about who your audience is. And we're going to need to go into more detail on that, so that'll be covered on the next slide. So the reason it says review the types of audience is that in the class, the traditional class, I frequently do an activity about analyzing the kinds of audiences that students have seen before. For you, this is probably the first time you've heard this though, although some of this is covered in the textbook as well. So the immediate audience is who's ever there right when you actually give the speech. Now, because of technology, the idea of an immediate audience is getting a little fluid. It's a little blurry. For example, if you were on Skype with somebody, they aren't physically there, but they've got all of the ability to feedback the same way that a regular audience would. So that's going to be something that we're going to take into account. Now, the difference between an immediate audience is an extended audience. An extended audience is anybody who wasn't there right away, but has the eventual ability to get the message. This could be any way that that message gets to them. Could be snippets of the speech that are passed along in some way. Could be little sound bites. Could be somebody actually recording it and giving it to somebody else. But the key here is immediate feedback possible? So if you were watching me give this presentation right now on Skype, then you would have the opportunity to make a noise and give me some actual feedback. Even a regular audience might not respond vocally, but they would still be able to give feedback non-vocally through their physical expression, maybe through laughter or sighs or rumbles when I get onto particular issues. So notice that there's a possibility that you could influence my message. That's an immediate audience. The way that we're doing the class right now is almost always going to be an extended audience. About the midway point, we're going to introduce a couple of ways to do some live interaction, but most of it's going to be through the extended process because the feedback isn't immediate. Now the key, the target audience. What part of the audience do you most want to reach? A very common mistake that people make in public speaking is they think of the audience as being one big group, and it's not. It's made up of a diverse group of individuals. Some speeches are going to be targeted to only some of those individuals. Of course, everybody else is still going to hear it, but you have to ask yourself, who's the people I really want to persuade? An interesting example of this was something I did in my consulting work. I've done some work in jury consulting, and one of the coolest one of these was not even my idea. It was something I was brought in later to deal with. It was a really big company that was being sued, and what they did was they put on a fake trial for a fake jury. And then they recorded by videotape the jury deliberating over the details of the case afterwards so that folks like me could review those deliberations and figure out what kind of arguments worked best on the jury. Now, that's an example of target audience because we would look at the types of jurors who would be more interested in the actual arguments that the company wanted to present. Other audience members might not like it as much. For a good example, younger women and younger men generally are not in favor of the death penalty, whereas older women and older men sometimes are. So that's an example of how you might adjust your speech depending on who you're speaking to. You might also have a divided audience, and that is an audience that's not just made up of some target audience members and some folks who aren't interested. It could be an audience that's deeply divided over your particular topic, which makes giving the speech to them pretty tricky, especially if some of them are hostile, which we'll get to in a moment. The key issue here is, how does the target group differ from the rest of the group? Sometimes you will have to give speeches to one part of the group that is so dramatically different than the rest that it'll make the speech really tough to give. One beautiful way that this was ever done was when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. It was a big exploration process that was actually being done that included, for the first time, a civilian on board who was a teacher that had actually been selected through a fairly national campaign, and people knew about it, which meant that when this regular teacher named Krista McAuliffe got on board, people across the country were watching, and I was one of the folks watching live when the shuttle exploded. That night, when President Reagan spoke about the tragedy, he had to speak to several audience members. He spoke to most regular folks, but he also knew that lots and lots of kids had been watching. And there's a section of the speech that's devoted specifically to the children who saw that and tried to allay their fears and remind them that, hey, exploration is dangerous, but that doesn't mean we should ever give up doing it. So that one part of the speech was devoted to one target section of the audience. Now, as I mentioned, there might also be hostile audience members. Now, hostile doesn't mean they're actually throwing things at you or heckling you. All that could be a part of it. The key issue to think about with hostile audience members is, why are they hostile? What is it that makes them not want to hear your message? The first is that they're hostile towards the subject. They might be fine with you, but they might not like what you have to tell them. Good examples of this have been when your friends who care about you and you care about them have tried to tell you something hard truth about yourself. That's an example of a time you were probably hostile toward the subject. You didn't want to hear the issue that they were trying to present to you. That's a problem, because it means the audience tends to short circuit and shut down while you're trying to make your pitch. They might also be hostile because of, or at least toward, the situation. Like, let's say, for example, you're taking a class that's really long, or it's really hot in the room, or it's just before lunch. These are all things that could affect whether or not the audience is even in the mood to hear the speech in the first place. I've been at some business meetings that have always had trouble with this because no matter how important the information is that we need to get, if the room itself and the audience isn't fairly comfortable, it's going to be hard for us to get that information. So it's not that we were upset, it just meant that we weren't in the best situation to hear a speech. And it's possible they just don't like you. One of my first consulting gigs ever was for a hospital that was working on trying to improve its public image. And one of the toughest things that I had to do was to point out to them that their main spokesman, that's the guy who was always the one on the news anytime the hospital made it into the newspaper, was a guy that people knew and didn't like. Because he was a guy who ran a series of funeral homes, nothing wrong with that business, but you don't want to associate it with your hospital. And he'd also run for office several times and lost. So imagine, think of any politician who you know well enough only because he's lost several times. Now imagine him being the spokesman for your company. So it wasn't that the audience hated the hospital, it's that the audience just didn't like this guy. So anytime he got up to speak, the audience wasn't very likely to pay attention to him. Now, an audience might be hostile for one or all of these reasons, but the key thing to remember here is that this is the actual opportunity. If you give a speech to an audience that already agrees with you and they clap, I don't care. The audience already agrees with you. You haven't actually done anything impressive. But if you can speak to an audience that doesn't want a message or doesn't want the message from you and persuade them and reach them, that's really impressive speaking. So remember, hostile audiences aren't an obstacle, they're an opportunity. Now that we've talked about who the audience is, we can ask ourselves a key question. How far can I get the audience to move within one speech? And that's the idea brought to us by the range of acceptance. This is something, again, that if you take later classes in comm theory, you'll pick up more of this, especially in the persuasion class. The range of acceptance is something like this. A common mistake people make about persuasion is they think that audience members are either like a light switch that they can simply turn on or off, or that they're an audience that either they agree or disagree, and that's it. But that's not true. Most topics don't have this kind of on-off switch as opposed to the kind of spectrum that I've got on the screen in front of you. No matter how divisive the topic is, the audience is probably somewhere on that spectrum. On one end, we have complete acceptance, and I mean complete. That means that not only does the person agree with the idea, but they kind of live their life because of it. Every single waking moment of it has to do with this. There was a movie called Fever Pitch about a guy who is a Boston Red Sox fan. And when the movie's beginning, we see a camera panning through his house, and every single thing in his entire house has Boston Red Sox paraphernalia on it. So like the couch and the lamp and all that kind of stuff. Until it gets to the bathroom and you see that the toilet paper has Yankees insignias on it. This is a guy who lives every moment of his life as a Red Sox fan. Now, most people aren't that way about most topics. They're usually going to be somewhere further down the spectrum from that. They might still be a fan, but they won't buy the toilet paper. See, there's a level of range of acceptance to think about here. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got complete rejection, which means not only do I disagree with you, but again, I live every day of my life in opposition to you in some way. I wake up in the morning, I eat my cereal thinking about how I'm going to make life hard for people who think the other position. Again, very few people live here, thankfully. Instead, most of us live somewhere in between. So this is one rare time that I'll actually tell you one of my feelings on a particular topic, which is gun control. So if you were to ask me where I am on the topic, I'd probably say on the far extreme, right? This is what the absolute extreme side of this position would be. That'd be a person who thinks no guns should exist at all, right? That's not me. And in fact, that's not most people. This would be a person who says the police shouldn't have guns and we shouldn't have the military and we should basically try to disinvent guns. Very few people actually believe that. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got the guy who drove to work in a tank, right? Who gives his kid a grenade launcher for his 8th birthday. Again, that person is pretty rare, thankfully. Instead, most people live somewhere in between. I'm probably right about here on the spectrum, which means I've got a lot of family members who are involved in hunting, have a lot of connections with the military and law enforcement, but at the same time I realize that there's an awful lot of people who kind of don't respect guns. It's not that I don't think people should have them, it's that I think they need to learn how to use them better and to understand what's real and what's not real about guns. So when you watch an action movie and a hero jumps through a window and shoots 4 guys right in the center of the forehead, and that tells people that having a gun in their home will make them safer, that's a myth. So that's why I tend to be a little bit more on this side of the gun control issue. Notice how I'm not a complete wacko in either direction. I simply tend to lean this way. And that doesn't guarantee I'm going to agree with you if you argue the topic. It just means I'm about in this area. So I'm okay with people owning their own weapons. I'm okay with people having concealed weapons if they've gone through a check process, and so on. Now this is what my range of acceptance would look like. That basically means how far could you move me either towards acceptance or towards rejection, depending on one speech. Now, if you're really, really persuasive, or I know you really well, or maybe I don't know much about the topic, that would change that range of acceptance. For example, the range of rejection would actually be that area outside, right? If you say an argument that's outside my range of acceptance, not only are you probably not going to be very effective, but I'll probably reject you even harder because you're asking for something that goes even beyond anything I'd be willing to listen to in the first place. So be careful of overreaching what the audience is actually willing to listen to. The further you are, the more likely I am to think you're insane. So notice that the first arrow I put up there was just barely outside the range of acceptance. That means I'd be surprised and I would disagree with you and reject you. But the second arrow, the one that goes a lot further to the right, now I'm worried about your mental health. Now I think that you and I could never agree on anything. So the further you are from me in the first speech, the more likely I am to reject anything you have to say. And I'm more likely to reject stuff you might say in the future. Now let's say, for example, I didn't know much about the topic, or some brand new information had come out. That might make my range of acceptance larger, like it is now in the picture. Now, that first speech might actually fit. It might actually be something I'd be willing to listen to. But the second one is probably still a no-go. Conversely, let's suppose that I've actually talked about this issue a whole bunch and done a lot of research on it. Now my window of movement, my range of acceptance, is even smaller than it was before. Some of you are that way. Some of you have studied a topic so well that it'd be really, really hard for me to move you even a tiniest bit on a particular topic. And that's normal. So the more you age, you're probably going to get a little more narrow in how you feel about certain things. Not because you're somehow becoming more conservative, but simply because you've thought about the issue enough times and read enough about it and talked with people enough about it that you've become pretty convinced that you're right on the topic, which makes it harder to move you out of that range of acceptance. This is one of the things that our assignment will do. Once I get your topics, I will put out a poll and we'll find out where the audience generally sits. Now, we're not going to find out where each and every person in the audience is. We're going to do it as an aggregate, right? So we'll put it all together anonymously. But you'll get the feedback that, hey, 30% of the audience disagrees with you on this topic, or 70% already agree with you. So what's the point, right? That'll be how we adjust what you actually ask the audience to guarantee that that second speech pushes them a little bit and makes it so you're not just speaking to the choir.